bin Laden and making America safe from terrorist bases. Pro-war liberal politicians and U.S. commanders have called for an increase of troops, an increase in development aid, and to win the hearts and minds of people, and peace talks with insurgents who are willing to recognize the Karzai government. The first proposal increasing the troop levels had already begun under Bush and continued as Obama announced in February for a deployment of 17,000 more troops to Afghanistan, and I think we'll actually see more as well. By midsummer, there will be some 55,000 U.S. troops there, alongside 32,000 non-U.S. NATO troops from Germany, Canada, Britain, and the Netherlands. Another 4,000 NATO troops I saw the other day had been recommended, which means there will probably be at least 4,000 more sent. And I also don't know if people saw the other day, France is now officially signed back onto NATO. So interpret that for whatever that means. The area of the occupation, so not just the number of troops sent there, but the area of this occupation is also expanding to include parts of Pakistan. The CIA has launched about 36 Predator strikes in Pakistan since late last summer, 2 of them during the Obama administration in the last 2 months. This escalation will provoke more civilian deaths, more resentment towards the occupation, more animosity with neighboring regional powers such as Russia, Iran, and China, and further overextend the U.S. military. The second angle, an increase in humanitarian aid, the development aspect we're hearing a lot about, it's put forward with the understanding that there will be increasing outrage against this escalation of the war. And the first thing we want to point out is that the U.S. development aid is notoriously bad at actually developing anything. 86% of U.S. foreign aid never leaves the United States. One way that this happens is we give countries money as aid so that they can buy back American products like wheat, which in turn makes it unprofitable for native farmers to grow competing products. Another way that the U.S. recycles its aid dollars is to create programs that are top-heavy with U.S. experts. It can cost up to $500,000 a year to keep an American in Afghanistan when you add the cost of salary, benefits, housing, and security. So that's part of what the increased efforts of diplomacy will be, is spending that development money and sending it right back here to the United States. Development aid would be used to continue buying off new allies, such as local strongmen, and so it can't be assured to reach ordinary Afghans. This version of militarized aid is seen to follow the models of the PRTs, the Provincial Reconstruction Teams, which integrate military action with development projects. Advocates of the PRTs would argue that embedding aid workers is the only way to keep them safe. But as international aid organizations say, the militarization of the aid has actually been what's increased the attacks on aid workers, civilian aid workers. And so it may soon be the case that only the embedded aid workers will be able to work in Afghanistan, thus increasing the U.S. military's ability to control where the aid goes, delivering aid only to friendly villages and withholding it from their unfriendly villages. Aid will then simply be one more means of exercising and reinforcing American power. The war, therefore, is actually obstructing the delivery of actual humanitarian aid. And finally, talk about peace talks is just that. It's to supplement this war strategy. It's to dampen the protests of those in the U.S. and around the world who will oppose the occupation and the escalation of it. It's also, in some ways, tactical, trying to split the Taliban resistance, trying to find those people who can be separated from the Taliban insurgency, the leadership of it. But the aim of peace talks is not to actually make peace or end the occupation. It's to continue the occupation with less public image problems. So what are the real reasons that the United States is in Afghanistan? The objective of the war is not humanitarian assistance to Afghans or the liberation of women, and it's only loosely connected to the hunt for al-Qaeda. What was presented as an effort to go after Osama bin Laden and his allies in retaliation for the September 11th attacks and to liberate Afghanistan has turned into a permanent occupation of a strategic Central Asian crossroads. So first, the response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks was to launch a vague war on terror, as we know. What is now widely known is that the Bush administration actually spent the 4 days after that discussing how they could go from there to unfolding regime change in Iraq. But they would need time to actually build a case for going into Iraq, because public opinion at the time was much more in support of going on to Afghanistan first and launching a campaign against the Taliban, who were protecting bin Laden. What may not yet be widely understood is the findings of the 9/11 Commission, that the Taliban were actually prepared to hand over bin Laden, but the U.S. continued the occupation anyway. Second, the 9/11 attacks called into question the military capabilities of the United States. And I think this is kind of one of the larger reasons why they felt they had to go into Afghanistan. Regardless of ever finding bin Laden himself, it became equally important to flex military muscle to deter not just terrorist attacks, but the possibility of challenges, economic and military challenges, posed to the United States and its role as singular superpower. And those challenges could come from countries like Russia, China, other regional powers like Iran. So instead, the result of advancing this occupation and going into Iraq has fed more animosity towards the U.S., likely creating the conditions for more terrorism, as well as weakening the U.S. reputation internationally. If the U.S. hoped to win support from the people of Afghanistan by ousting the unpopular Taliban, it has achieved precisely the opposite. The area has become more unstable, and the occupation has given people in the region more reason to hate the U.S. government. But there were additional motivations for invading Afghanistan. The long-term U.S. presence in Afghanistan as a strategic position actually being the goal in itself. The oil and natural gas of Central Asia are important to the future of global economy because they're undeveloped and they have the potential of rapidly expanding output. After the Soviet Union's collapse, the CIA turned its focus from the destructive civil war and instability going on in Afghanistan to the destructive civil war in Afghanistan to the newly independent republics to the north. But once the Taliban gained a decisive victory, the Clinton administration saw renewed hope for gas and oil pipelines. Such pipelines would go through Afghanistan, bypassing Russia and Iran. Even before the Taliban took power, Zalmay Khalilzad, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name, Khalilzad, the neoconservative, he's an important one though, the neoconservative Afghan American was helping California's UNICAL and the CIA in negotiations with the Taliban. Another note on him. He began as a Reagan advisor in the U.S., helping the U.S. to actually support the Mujahideen, these warlords, in the 80s, and he ended up as a National Security Council staffer in the Bush administration. A founder of the right-wing think tank Project for a New American Century, he was the man behind the scenes from 2002 to 2005 in Kabul, which many people knew about at the time, especially the people in Afghanistan, firming the relationship between the Northern Alliance warlords, the Karzai government in Kabul, and the United States. I'm not suggesting here that the pipelines in Afghanistan were the only immediate reason for invading Afghanistan. However, they would just be an added benefit, giving the U.S. political control of those lines as long as it continues the occupation. I think that's important, as long as it continues the occupation. More important than a pipeline through Afghanistan, though, is one through Afghanistan's neighbors, Azerbaijan and Georgia, to the Black Sea, which they began in 2005. Occupying Afghanistan allowed the U.S. to plant forces also in the resource-rich Central Asian states. This put U.S. forces on Russia's doorstep on both sides of China, and following the invasion of Iraq, on both sides of Iran. The war on terror and talk of liberating Afghans is nothing more than a cover for spreading U.S. imperial power around the globe. It's no surprise that the military commanders and presidents leave this part out of their press releases, but it is discouraging when anti-war activists ignore these reasons and continue, in vain of course, to look for ways that the U.S. can intervene in a positive way. The general attitude of these people is that it was a mistake to go into Afghanistan, but since we're there, we might as well try and fix it. But it's impossible. It's impossible that the same military that has killed countless civilians and lied about it, tortured people to death, and armed war criminals around the countryside, or even the same government that can't even keep people fed and employed in their own backyard, can accomplish anything positive in Afghanistan other than getting the troops out and giving reparations. As Brian Castler, an IVAW member, says, no matter how Obama spins a surge into Afghanistan, it's still a criminal occupation, and we don't want it. Thank you.